Yours, please.
Hi. How are you? Should we get on stage now or?
Hi, how are you? Good to see you. Good to see you as well. Hi, Charles. How are you? Daniel. Good to see you.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi there, Daniel. Good to see you.
Okay, shall we start? Hello, everyone. Please take your seats. We are starting. Oprostite, jel sređeno sve? Možemo početi, jel? Minister Grlić Radman, Speaker Jandrokovic, thank you for your inspiring remarks and for welcoming and hosting us here at the Dubrovnik Forum. Good morning, everyone. I'm honored and delighted to moderate this think tank panel on emerging powers in a multipolar world, many paths, one destination. We are joined today by a distinguished group of experts, bringing perspectives from across Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the United States. I would like to introduce our panelists. Henry Huyao Wang, founder and president, Center for China and Globalization from China. Charles Powell, director, Elcano Royal Institute from Spain. Luanda Mpungoze, outreach and partnership manager, South African Institute of International Affairs from South Africa. Rachel Rizzo, senior fellow, strategic studies program in Observer Research Foundation from India. And Daniel Kochish, Senior Fellow, Center on Europe and Eurasia, Hudson Institute, United States. And last but not the least, Manuel Correa do Lago, Senior Consultant, Brazilian Center for International Relations in Brazil. So we are very fortunate. Thank you so much for joining us. We often describe the emerging order as multipolar, but it is not always clear what we mean by multipolar. Does it refer to a more balanced international system, a more fragmented one, or simply a world in which many actors seek greater autonomy, multi-alignment, new partners, diversification, while still operating under the strong gravitational pull of US-China competition? To assess whether emerging powers are becoming new poles in the order, we also need to ask what makes a country a pole. Is it its economic weight? Is it technological capacity, especially now in the AI times, military power, demographic scale, institutional leadership, or the ability to preserve autonomy under pressure? So our discussion today seeks to address three questions. The first one, are we moving toward a genuinely multipolar order or toward a new bipolarity? What forms of influence are emerging powers actually exercising? The second question, how is this reconfiguration of global order affecting multilateral processes as well as US and EU strategies? And then finally, where do we see opportunities for constructive cooperation among emerging powers and between established and emerging powers? So for our first question on the shape of the emerging order, I would like to begin with perspectives from China, Brazil, and South Africa. So maybe the best place to begin is actually with China, because next year we see that it will be a 30-year anniversary since the 1997 China-Russia Declaration on the Multipolar World. And last month, President Xi and President Putin renewed that language and renewed the initiative in a new declaration on multipolarity and the new type of international relations. And we also saw that President Xi met with President Trump, and there was a lot of talk about the crucial bilateral relationship for the world order. So is China's vision genuinely multipolar? And if so, who are the poles? Or are we entering a bipolar system? So maybe, shall we start with Huayan?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mihaela, for this great moderation. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizer, for inviting me and for to this beautiful Dubrovnik, scenic, city that is famous in the world. No, I think absolutely you're right. We're getting into a multipolar world now, and that is already a reality. I remember last year I was in Berlin. We kicked off Munich Security Conference annual report. The title of the report was Multipolarity. I was one of the 4 panelists there to kick off that report. But since then, I see more recognition of multipolarity and multipolar world, because it's not, it's already a reality that everybody seems to accept that now. So, but the challenge we're having today is that we're in a multipolar world, but then we're not having a multilateral system to support this multipolar world. So in that transition, we're trying to reach some new equilibrium. So you ask, who are the new polos? Absolutely, I'm sure we're here in Europe. European Union is a polo. Of course, the United States is a polo. I think China is a polo. India and global South countries are polos too, and new powers probably as well. But the thing is now, we could have a new big polo rising is the BRICS countries. For example, the BRICS countries now, GDP has already reached 40% almost, and that counts about half of the global population, whereas G7, I think it's, GDP has greatly declined, and also represents only, about 1 billion people. So it's quite a contrast. So I see these two big, if you want to say have a bipolar bubble, there's a two big polar like that, but ideologically divided sometimes. So what I hope is that now we're getting into a multipolar world, but then all the countries, all the polos must work together, like we come to the Dubrovnik Forum to talk about that. And then, gradually build up a consensus. We need to reform the current global system, the multilateral system. We established, for example, we're not not going to turn away the existing system, but to improve, enhance, enlarge. We should reform multilateral system, UN, WTO, WHO. But China actually play a huge role now in supporting the existing system. Like United States is quitting 66 international organizations, and China is actually supporting many of that. For Mr. Wang, has just recently mentioned China has proposed that, President Xi actually proposed global governance initiative. China is now the second largest donor to the United Nations, largest peace troop sending country among the P5. Mm-hmm. And also when U.S. pulling out of the WHO, China announced going to donate $500 million to WHO. So I think China plays a positive role, contribute 30% of the global GDP growth, and become the largest trading nation with 140 countries. So I think, as one polo from China is going to be a stabilizer, promoter, and, cooperator for the new multipolar world.
Wonderful. I think it's important to stress the entrepreneurial initiatives, and I think World Data Organization is also the one getting shaped up.
Yes.
So thank you, and let's go now to Latin America and Brazil, So Brazil has also long supported a more multipolar and representative international order, and there was often an emphasis on avoiding rigid blocs and really empowering multilateralism, especially like these big conferences, multilateral diplomacy of sustainable development. That was really something that Brazil is known for all over the world. So is Brazil's vision of multipolarity similar to China's, or where do you see the trends in Brazil? And also, if you could broaden, please, to some hemispheric challenges that you see in the current order.
Thank you very much, Mihaela, and thank you very much for this invitation. We are very honored in CEBRI to participate of this forum, and me particularly, I'm still under the spell of seeing Dubrovnik for the first time yesterday, going to the old city, so I'm very much taken by this at the moment. Yes, what I would say is that Brazil's commitment to multilateralism is a very old story, because when European powers were fighting themselves in the late 19th century and early 20th century, Brazil established each one of its frontiers, one of them with France, the Guyana, one of them with England, the ex-English Guyana, and each one of the South American countries through negotiations and arbitration. So there's not 1 inch of Brazilian frontier which is the result, for instance, of conquest. Everything has been the result of the application of international law and the resource to arbitration. So after the Second World War, when the United Nations were created and all the mechanisms were created, Brazil was very active in the making of it, and we have no reason to believe that the best way is the multilateral, which in no way impedes bilateral strengthening of ties, and that's why, for instance, for Brazil, Mercosur, for instance, is so important. BRICS is an important forum. So the other aspect we value very much is that we think that your very good question about what makes a country a pole. We believe there are all reasons for Latin America being a pole, because we have almost 700 million people there. We have probably the largest, let's say, biodiversity of the planet. We have, on the whole, a clean energy matrix. And we have become, if we take together the Mercosur countries, we have become really a very, very important and successful food producer for the world. So there should be no reason why we shouldn't do that in other areas as well. And we understand that African countries can become poles, and we see the examples of China, the extraordinary example of China in the last 30 years, and more recently of India. So very remarkable achievement. So we look forward to a multilateral, to a multipolar world where each continent will develop its own avocations. And in the recent context of China and the US, we at Mercosur see with great enthusiasm the agreements we are progressing with Singapore, with Japan, and now very recently the very, very important agreement with the European Union. So we look very much forward to see Europe with its half a billion people and so important GNP to become more of a pole than it has been so far. So yes, so we welcome a world of many poles.
Wonderful. Thank you. So turning to South Africa, and from South African perspective, does multipolarity create greater agency for African states? And what do you perceive in South Africa in terms of the debates and discussion on multipolarity?
Thank you very much, and it's a singular honor to also be joining this panel of think tankers and the knowledge producers of the world. I think I perhaps want to take a little bit of a step back and reflect on the fact that when Africa enters global fora or global systems, it enters them already established. If you look at the birth of multilateralism and the creation of what we call the Bretton Woods systems or institutions, we were in the periphery when those were created. And if you go on then to look at this birth of a single hegemony, it was post the Cold War when the US kind of won the contestation with the Soviet Union. So again, there, Africa kind of positioned itself together with the Global South as kind of non-aligned, forming this non-aligned movement. So we're entering the systems already established, and we kind of play a very peripheral role, not by choice, but because of how the system has been set. Nevertheless, I think cooperation and the underpinnings of cooperation is what we understand, is why we think that these systems are important. And we want to cooperate within those systems and kind of be the forebearers of the rules and the norms that make the global system that we work on. And I think I'm going to rely on the minister's plea for us to have very frank conversations, is that even as we enter this kind of these systems that have been put before us, it hasn't been as recognized as equal players. It's almost like it's a contestation of geopolitical happenings and underpinnings, and basically we are being mobilized to kind of take sides. Nevertheless, I think what we increasingly are communicating as a region is that we actually have agency beyond that, and we actually like the global system to have rules that are fair and equitable. But as it stands, it's whose rules and who do those rules apply to? Because certainly if a country in the global south does something, the world reacts very strongly. However, if it's a country in the global north, we see that being mum. So that level of hypocrisy becomes a very, very fundamental kind of critique that we raise as South Africa and largely as the African continent. Nevertheless, I think the important thing is that we are certainly headed towards a multipolar world. We probably are in it, but I would argue that it's a multipolar world with very special features, because now we are seeing the role of emerging markets and middle powers being pronounced like never before. So South Africa is one of the BRICS member countries, and we've received a lot of critique for being a member. In the initial stages when BRICS was being formed, it was looked at kind of in the West as a counter to global cooperation and the multilateral system. But if you really investigate the positioning of BRICS, they've actually emerged as the protectors of multilateralism when the people who created the system have regressed and eroded the rules and the norms that we know to be fundamental and key. So we look largely to these platforms of plurality as well as cooperation as a space where we can probably effect reform, both from inside the multilateral system, but possibly even outside, creating alternatives that will work for the global south. So certainly multipolarity from my perspective, but with special features. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that the three speakers actually introduced BRICS as an important aspect in the multipolar debates. So to what extent do the three of you see that BRICS is evolving as a platform to create a building block for like a future system, or actually more, as I think, Luanda, you mentioned, as something around which the core of the new system will be built? Because if we look at, for example, Russian statements, it's very much the new system will be built around BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So that's a very different trajectory, then BRICS being a building block of the new international system that needs reform, needs modernization and upgrading. So what are your thoughts here? I don't know, whoever wants to start.
Perhaps I could add on that. I think that whether it's BRICS or SCO or others, it's really a new form of multipolar world taking place. But I do think that they don't want to, surround the old system or establish a new system. They want to cooperate within the system we already have. And what I think now is probably more important is that the old system, the Bretton Woods system, reflect what 80 years in the past. But a lot of things are happening now, like climate, like AI, like pandemic, global debt, like robotic. All those things are happening. And I think that BRICS countries and, of course, G7, G20, UN, and we should all work together. It's just we have a multi-stakeholder now to this war, rather than it's only unipolar or one stakeholder, right? It's everybody's stakeholder, all those polar stakeholders. So I think it's a joint effort now. So by having all those big blocks together, but then really we need some anchor role of BRICS country probably for some time, but also European Union and United States too. So I think we need to really get those big, polar work together for a better world.
Thank you.
So perhaps I'd say that BRICS was born out of a realization that middle powers or developing economies need to cooperate. And its mandate started as largely economic vis-a-vis trade. And it morphed into a bigger kind of global governance project. And I think Henry has mentioned that the areas that the BRICS looks at now have expanded. We're looking at AI, we're looking at climate. So the agenda is really expansive. And I think the fundamental underpinning there is largely the recognition that the system isn't fair and responding to that. But I think increasingly, and even beyond the BRICS, because there's also another grouping called MICTA and many other corporations that exist, is that the more the system is unfair and the more systems and institutions are being weaponized against those that are considered the losers in the system, the more they're going to want to innovate and come up with alternatives. So if I look, for instance, at the local payment in local currencies, that was born out of a decision by certain countries to impose unilateral sanctions as opposed to referring to a multilateral system. And we increasingly saw the weaponization of that. So the more you do it, the more countries are going to want to innovate and look for alternatives. So I kind of see BRICS and as kind of both. It is a system that is challenging the current order, not because it wants to kind of make significant changes, but it just wants reform and equity. But moreover than that, I mean, countries do advance their own interest, and some of them are not aligned with any of the other countries' interests. But that's important because then the consensus conversation then comes to the fore. And BRICS is specifically interesting from my perspective because if there's no consensus, a project, whatever it is that's being discussed doesn't move forward, and then they will agree to disagree and then move on to other platforms. But largely in areas that have been very difficult, they have been able to find consensus. So I see it as largely that, Mahalia, it's a combination of the weaponization of systems and the lack of reform of the current system to actually be fair and equitable. And that's where BRICS is largely responding at the moment.
Thank you. Any other comments on this? Yes.
Yes. No, I would say that that is, we are so much in need of forums, sometimes some diagonal, transversal forums, so that some specific questions are better treated in those forums rather than in others. So I think it would be a great mistake to look at BRICS as a sort of anti-Western mechanism. I think it is in the same way as the G7 is not an anti-global South mechanism. I think it gives immense opportunities of dialogue between countries which have not so far developed bilaterally their relationships, and I believe it enriches, let's say, the diplomatic agenda by having this particular sort of outlook. Now, of course, BRICS has to live to its expectations. So far, I believe it is still more a project than a reality. But definitely, it is not, let's say, a group set against another set of countries or groups. So that's my view.
I would certainly say yes to that, because this is the work, the BRICS work I'm doing. Actually, the data shows that it's most of the cooperation is sustainable development, industrial development, and development centered. So let us go now to India. And Rachel, if I can ask you to give us a sense, India seems to be really the master of multi-alignment and thinking about multipolarity, making the most of alignments both with the United States, with BRICS. And how do you see now India is also actually chairing the BRICS group? But more broadly, what do you see the debates are merging into in India, and where do you see the current situation?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I'd like to echo the other panelists in saying thank you for the invitation. It's a beautiful city and it's wonderful to be here. I want to start with a little anecdote that can sort of frame whether or not we're talking about multipolarity or bipolarity. There were two really important meetings that happened last month. One got a lot more airtime than the other one. The first was a very highly publicized meeting between President Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. Trump went into this meeting, in my opinion, sort of from a place of relative weakness, needed to try to get the Chinese to help convince the Iranians to open the Strait of Hormuz, needed a deal on critical minerals. We're obviously having a different conversation today. This is a very fast-moving conflict in the Middle East. But there was also another meeting that happened simultaneously. And this was the meeting of the BRICS foreign ministers that took place in New Delhi. Now, my question for the audience is, what meeting do you think the Chinese foreign minister went to? He stayed in Beijing for the meeting with President Trump. So I think this gives you a good sense of maybe how both the US and China are thinking about this moment. Neither label fits cleanly. The US-China relationship still organizes a lot of the system's gravity, especially on tech and security, but the texture of the world, I think underneath it, is multipolar, and India plays an important role here. I think obviously the difficulty is that when you look at a bloc like BRICS, there really isn't an organizing principle or a set agenda, because there isn't really a vision of what a non-US led multipolar order might look like and how BRICS could use their collective power. But I think India's chairmanship is a useful lens, because it shows the limits of treating BRICS as a coherent anti-Western bloc, as you were saying. India, what have they done? Okay, so they've pushed BRICS towards more of an economic and institutional theme. So looking at things like the new development bank reform, looking at things like local currency settlement, supply chain resilience, and away from the more confrontational anti-Western framing that perhaps Russia and China might not necessarily prefer, but they might find more helpful in a bloc like this. And I think this is exactly what you were saying, Mihaela. This is multi-alignment in practice, and multi-alignment has been a mainstay of Indian foreign policy for decades, and it will remain a mainstay of Indian foreign policy. India sits in the BRICS and in the Quad simultaneously, and I think its chairmanship really reflects this. It can strengthen the Global South's bargaining position without committing to a bloc identity against the US or Europe. And some things to watch out for. I mean, I think it's important to look for potential friction. I think we'll talk about China, India in a little bit. We could look at potential friction with China over expansion and any rhetoric about de-dollarization. India has always hit the brake on anything that reads as a unified currency challenge to the dollar. But I think the bigger takeaway is that the BRICS chairmanship reveals the organization's internal coherence as much as it reveals its growing weight. And I think India's year is a really good test case for whether the BRICS can be a platform for several simultaneous models and simultaneous strategies at once, rather than needing to coalesce around a single one.
Thank you. So I want to now pivot a bit toward our question 2. And how does this reconfiguration of the order affect multilateral processes? Some of that we mentioned, US and EU strategies. And how should the United States and the European Union adjust their strategies? Are they adapting existing institutions, being newly entrepreneurial, or how do you see their strategies evolving? So let me start now and bring in Daniel, please.
Thank you for that. Again, pleasure to be here. Dubrovnik is almost too nice of a city, though, to hold a conference, as we were talking about earlier. But the fact that we've been able to hold so many people here, I think, is a testament to the conversation we've already been having. I think similar to some, I think probably where you're going, Rachel, I believe that we sort of right now sit in an unhappy, asymmetric bipolar world, more than a multipolar one. There's the US and China and their respective blocs. Neither is particularly happy with sharing the stage, but they do. I think that there are many states which would like to see the emergence of a multipolar world order, but I do not believe that it has yet emerged because there isn't a coherent structure, I think, outside of those two blocs. The Trump administration, I think, they believe that similarly, the unipolar moment is irretrievable. It's not worth the investment to try to recapture. But they also believe that there's a need, I think, for shock therapy, both domestic and internationally, to best position the United States for long-term success in the world order that it is now. So you see that this is animating some of the U.S. actions in Latin America, efforts on critical minerals, which have been a key focus of the administration. There's also a focus, I think, on getting the American House in order internally, reconstituting a border, key focus once again on manufacturing. And another, I think, is also reforming U.S. defense acquisitions. It's a Sisyphean task, perhaps, but one I think that the U.S. believes is necessary to adapt to the challenges that the country currently faces. Internationally, the administration's mantra is sort of on fixing what they believe is unfair trade relations. And I think that from the administration's perspective, what they just broadly view, I think, that what the U.S. has been doing isn't working. So let's try to shake things up. And so who would have thought that the Venezuelan government, for instance, would have been touting, in their words, a joint operation with the U.S. to eliminate a drug kingpin just a few weeks ago. This just shows you how quickly I think things are adapting and changing to this sort of reactive momentum of the administration. And this animates, I think, as well how the U.S. under President Trump is approaching Europe. It's quite a bit about shaking things up. It's once again, there's a focus on demographics, a belief that the U.S. is trying to utilize shocks to try to change the European trajectory. Not all of these shocks, of course, have been well received, and the Greenland example, of course, is the key one there. But I do think that I don't see Europe sort of evolving into its own pole. I think that it would be a mistaken attempt to do so, and I don't think that it's likely to happen. I think just this week, the EU joined the Pax Silica. I think that is very indicative of the fact that Europe is going to remain, I think, part of sort of the US-led Western bloc, rather than trying to constitute sort of a pole of its own. And simply put, the scale of the challenge, I think, from the autocratic pole is too strong for the US or Europe to simply overcome without the other. So what is the U.S. doing right and doing wrong? Well, I think that some of its efforts on manufacturing, on supply chains, which will be a focus, I think, later in the day, I think has been a success so far. I do think that there has been some mismanagement of alliances, which I think is harming a bit the way the ability of the United States and Europe to work together to address sort of the state of the current world order. And I think as well, I think that there's a real missed opportunity so far from the U.S. in terms of how it is engaging with other regions, with Africa, with Latin America. I mean, when I'm looking, the United States currently has 5, that's it, confirmed ambassadors in Africa. By contrast, China is only lacking an ambassador in 1. Russia is expanding its presence in Africa, and the U.S. I think is largely absent from the continent. So I think there are real missed opportunities when you think about the way that the world is progressing. Finally, maybe a word on sort of the multilateral system from a U.S. perspective. I think in its current form, there's a belief in many quarters of the U.S. that the multilateral system is simply no longer fit for purpose. And reforming many of these institutions has proven impossible. And that these institutions will not necessarily magically start delivering absent that reform. And so what is possible, I think, from a U.S. perspective is developing new skinny organizations or groupings of nations with shared systems and values that can theoretically deliver on the raison d'etre outside, in a better way than the multilateral system. We had, in April, we had the U.S. Trade Representative, and he sort of encapsulated this view when he talked about the WTO, saying that the U.S. put forward ideas and reform papers, other countries sent proposals, but that the organization is simply unable to reform. And therefore, in his words, probably we need to get back to smaller groupings of more like-minded countries. And I think that probably is in many ways the dominant view, at least from the conservative side of the political spectrum in the U.S., but I think has some resonance on the other area. So I do not foresee sort of a return to the multinational world order as we once knew. The U.S. is unwilling and perhaps unable to enforce the rules. Europe can diplomatically, institutionally support multilateralism, but cannot enforce the rules. And I don't think that the 2 dominant blocks that I started my remarks on agree on even what the rules are, and whether they can or should be followed. So I don't see sort of some renewal of the multilateral system. I think that it's going to be much more sort of these smaller groupings and hedging behavior.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on 2 points. So is your sense that the United States is pursuing primacy? Is it political? Is it economic? Because in light of the national security strategy, so that's the first follow-up. And the second one is, there are different, especially in the US debate, there are different debates on whether Trump is a multilateral president or not. Obviously, multilateralism at the universal level is different than multilateralism at less than universal level. So what would you suggest, are we now seeing the end of primacy ambition, or do you see it differently based on the national security strategy?
I think that there's a recognition from the administration and from the U.S. that the world simply is a bipolar world order, that the challenge that the U.S. faces is in many ways much more significant and sort of multifaceted than we did during the Cold War, and that the idea of recovering primacy is sort of a mirage. But at the same time, I think that there's a recognition that the U.S. is quite vulnerable. And so I think that the shock, for instance, I think that the critical minerals stoppage was a true shock, I think, to the administration, and has informed, I think, some of the ways that it's behaved since that time. And so what they're trying to do is to shore up those areas where the U.S. is especially vulnerable. And this pressure, I think, is also animating the way that it's behaving towards its allies. It's much like Athens. When it was feeling pressured by Sparta, it kept pressing its allies, and I think that the U.S. is doing the same thing, feeling, I think, the pressure from the Chinese-led bloc, and it's sort of animating the way that it's really pressuring its allies to sort of move quickly and in a way in sort of in alignment with the United States. And that, of course, also has some downsides, because you can press too hard, and I think that in some cases the United States has done that, and it's hampered actually its ability to sort of work together with its European allies. But frankly speaking, I don't see that relationship is going to endure, and I don't see that changing. But I think that I don't know if it's sort of an end of ambition for primacy, but I think it's a recognition that that world is past, and sort of we are in a bipolar world order, and the U.S. needs to do many things in order to be able to compete and survive in that system as it currently is.
Thank you, thank you. So, Charles, please, turning over to you, if you could tell us more about the perspective that you see from the EU, and also feel free to comment. Thank you for your patience. Feel free to comment on anything you would like to.
Thank you, and it's lovely to be here. Since we are on EU territory, right? So
exactly.
Let me try and say something nice about the European Union. But before I do that, Mihail, and thank you for your moderation and all of the exchanges we've had prior to this event. Intellectually and academically, it's interesting that all of you, except one speaker, assumed that we are living in a multipolar world, and yet we don't actually, we can't name the poles. We don't have a list of poles. And I find it interesting, for example, there are 9 countries in the world which have nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. Surely, that makes some states more important and more relevant than others, but I would be reluctant to regard North Korea as a pole. I would be reluctant to regard Pakistan as a pole, and I have my doubts about the state of Israel as a pole. These are countries which perhaps punch above their weight, but I don't think they are poles. So I think we need to think more carefully about what we mean when we talk about a multipolar order. And I agree with our American colleague in the sense that I think we are transitioning towards something, and it is still unclear as to whether the destination will be a multipolar world or perhaps a G2 bipolar world. The Trump-Xi Jinping summit was mentioned. What I found interesting about that is that they both seemed pretty comfortable with the idea of a G2 world. That was my impression. Perhaps a declining power having to adjust a decline, and a rising power, already fully risen in many ways, China, beginning to enjoy the fruits of being a superpower and acknowledged as such by the declining power. So, I think the jury is still out on whether we are actually moving towards a multipolar world. What about the European Union? Well, this is also very interesting because in all of its official documents, the European Union supports multipolarity. It claims to look forward to the emergence of a multipolar world, but fascinatingly, it never describes itself as a pole. And that is not entirely surprising because what are we? We are a union of 27 sovereign member states. I always argue we are, above all, an internal market of 450 million people, which isn't nothing. Remember, the EU, with a population of only 6% of the world's total population, produces about 17–80% of the world's economy. So that's not insignificant. But internally, we are very reluctant to regard ourselves as a pole, and I think that has a lot to do with our history, the history of European integration. We are a project for peace. We were born to avoid a fourth Franco-German war after the 1870 World War I and World War II wars. We are a community of law, and I still believe that we are a normative power. And this means that we find it extremely difficult to think in terms of hard power, of military power. Although, by the way, last year we spent 380 billion euros on defense, which is not much less than what the Chinese claim to spend. And I say claim because my Chinese colleague will correct me. There's a bit of a debate as to the accuracy of official Chinese figures. But be that as it may, we are spending a lot on defense. But we are reluctant to see ourselves as a pole for lots of reasons. The 4 or 5 largest states, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, maybe Poland, all have their own ambitions, but at the same time, as the great Belgian politician Paul-Henri Spaak said, Europe consists of 2 kinds of states, small states and small states that haven't realized that they're small yet. And I include France and Germany in that, frankly. Even the countries with populations of more than 50 million are really actually rather small states, and Germany is beginning to discover this, I think. So we are, to quote a former recently deceased Spanish foreign minister, Giuseppe Piqué, we are a herbivore surrounded by carnivores. And in a sense, we are very ill-suited to do well in this increasingly transactional world. Now, I would like to think that the EU may one day decide that it wants to be a pole, but we're certainly not there yet, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. So, during our discussion initially, a question of middle powers emerged. And there was recently a very important speech by Mark Carney on middle powers, and it had some of the dramatic elements, either you're at the table or you're on the menu onwards. So, and that made me reflect, like, is there any middle power coalition that you would find that really is a successful example of, let's say, if Mark Carney's idea went forward, like that would be like the path to follow. So I wanted maybe to go to Luanda on the question of IPSA. So IPSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, was this like major middle power coalition. And I still remember South African foreign minister before South Africa was going into, was joining BRICS, said like she hoped that BRICS will strengthen IPSA. But then we have seen basically BRICS overtaking a lot of IPSA's agendas. So from your perspective, why this middle power coalition did not thrive as much as BRICS, or what does it take to make middle power coalition thrive? And then like, if I can ask the rest of the panel to think about which is a successful middle power coalition that you would like to highlight, that like Carney's speech would potentially, you know, incite you about like, oh, this is the middle power coalition that worked. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mihaela. And with your permission, I just maybe want to react to one or two things, and
yes,
then I'll
please.
come to the question. I think our colleague raised the interesting point about just U.S. ambassadorial representation in Africa currently, and kind of what that speaks to in terms of relations with that region. And I think a fundamental thing that is increasingly intolerable in this current order that we are in this global system is kind of the paternalistic kind of finger-waging behavior that we see towards countries that are kind of considered less powerful. And here I want to kind of bring in an anecdote of what's currently happening in South Africa. So we are one of the countries that were fortunately allocated an ambassador who's just kind of started. But even before the ambassador had the chance to present credentials to the president, he had already been in the media behaving in what we consider undiplomatic behavior, very critical of the government, very critical of our foreign policy and relations with certain countries. But if you look across the Atlantic and you go to the US, and a South African ambassador to the US was participating in a webinar where he called President Trump a white supremacist, he was immediately expelled and given 72 hours to leave the country. So that kind of role and attitude towards kind of relations with Africa, I don't think that there's a space for it in this current global system. And as you know, the US tries to push, I think the global South will also try to push even more. And we also see that in Latin America with the whole Huawei kind of debacle, where the US wanted Latin America to take a certain position. But Latin America kind of introduced the concept of non-alignment, which is not the same as neutrality, but we're also seeing kind of this concept emerge. I mean, we know the non-aligned movement of the Cold War era, and now there's also now this non-alignment, which is really underpinned and enforced by we will advance our relations based on our national interests and our foreign policy. So I think I just wanted to kind of make that emphasis, just kind of provoked by the interesting points that was brought to the fore. And before I speak about middle powers, I think it's important I think we've all acknowledged that the world is not the same. We heard it during the opening remarks, and I think more or less all the colleagues on the floor have acknowledged that. If we look at what's happening in the WTO, I mean, it's correct. We're looking at plurilateral approaches now. But the question is whether the plurilaterals are undermining the fundamental principles of multilateralism. And that's why you find countries such as India and South Africa blocking the plurilaterals. And I think South Africa has now conceded, because it was under a lot of pressure, that it's blocking progressiveness. But it's interesting to me that we speak about progression as plurilaterals, because what does that say then about multilateralism? So South Africa now supports this, but will not be participating in the plurilateral approach. However, India is still blocking it because it is fundamentally safeguarding the principles of multilateralism. So if I look at the role of middle powers now, and it's not just something that has emerged with the speech of Prime Minister Carney. In fact, we have been saying this for quite some time in the Global South, but it seems as though he was kind of met with the moment, because when he made that speech in Davos, it really transcended and it created a moment globally. But really, we have been saying this. We have been saying this. And if I look at speeches by our foreign ministers and probably some of our African governments as well, we've been preaching the concept of partnerships between middle powers and partnering to ensure that we also have fruitful alternatives that will complement the multilateral system. So I think in terms of whether we've defined or haven't defined the rules of this current order, you'll find out what the rules are if a global south country invades another country. However, the rules become ambiguous if the US kind of captures a sitting head of state, whether he's right or wrong, but from a principle of multilateralism, the global order, capturing and detaining a sitting head of state, where does it fall in the rules? It's very ambiguous when it's that, but when it's Russia invading Ukraine, you kind of see that coming out quite significantly. And perhaps what I'll end off with is perhaps the role of Europe. We in Africa are very confused sometimes by the response that we see emerging from Europe. We consider Europe a very important player in the global system. And yet, when South Africa takes to the ICJ on the Palestine matter, for the first couple of months where it was really, really significant to see Europe kind of emerge and say something, it was quiet. And yet, on Ukraine, countries in Africa were being pressured to kind of condemn Russia. So again, it's just this hypocrisy and double standards that are leaving us a little bit dumbfounded. But nevertheless, I think the role of the middle powers currently is to safeguard the rules. We know what the rules are. They are defined in instruments and frameworks. And I see increasingly the middle powers coming together to kind of be the norm entrepreneurs and the safeguard of the current rules and norms.
This is a very important point. So if anybody would like to respond.
Carney is my hero, can I say this in public? But he said medium powers, and then which ones did he mention? He said Canada should work with the EU, with Australia, with Japan. He's not really talking about medium-sized powers, he's talking about like-mindedness. And that's a different kettle of fish completely. I don't see a coalition of medium-sized powers having adding anything significant to the equation. The real question is, are we still dividing the world into democracies and autocracies? I think we're not. I think that ship sailed, sadly, in my view, in many cases. But he's really talking about like-mindedness. He's talking about countries that share a similar worldview and a similar interpretation of multilateralism, which I think has very little in common with Chinese or Russian interpretations, and probably North American ones under the Trump administration as well.
Yes. Rachel, and then Brian.
I think what we should also, we should also look at the potential of the growth of the relationship between the European Union and India. So when you look back at this year, two major things happened in January in New Delhi. First, the EU and India signed a free trade agreement, the mother of all deals, as they call it. This was as Ursula von der Leyen was Prime Minister Modi's guest of honor at the Republic Day celebrations. This is an FTA that had been being negotiated for over 20 years. And in my opinion, the mercurialness of the Trump administration and the desire to create something new and build new partnerships really offered the two sides the momentum they needed to get this over the finish line. But the second thing that happened in January alongside the FTA was the EU and India signed a security and defense partnership, which offers an EU-wide framework to build the relationship with India already being driven by member states in the EU. So I think there's a few things here. First, you can look at real defense industrial base cooperation between the two sides. You can look at supply chain resilience. You can look at the green transition. But you can also look at something and I don't think gets as much airplay or much discussion, which is that students are looking to go to other places besides the US now, specifically Indian students. So when you look at the mobility and when you look at partnerships, youth partnerships, Europe is a real a place for Indian students to go as they look at the United States as a less desirable market. So we're really losing out there, and the EU is something that's really really gaining.
Yes, go ahead.
Answering your question and taking the cue from the Paul-Henri observation, in a certain way, the EU is a proof that middle powers can get together and obtain together important, successful results. Though, as Charles has very well mentioned, the EU has not, with its 27 members, has not formed, let's say, a political unit. But if we haven't, in our discussion so far, put Russia in the equation, and we have been raised in a bipolar world where Russia was the other side. And speaking about Europe, if, as it may be happening, the war in Ukraine, against all expectations, after 4 years, maybe is taking another turn. Maybe is this not a first success of a united Europe, as Europe, in a way, has taken the responsibility of giving this sort of support. I'm very impressed by the consequences of those 4 years in terms of the weakening of some of the elements which cemented the world order before. For instance, the fact that Syria has changed, the fact that you don't have any longer the Venezuela-Cuba connection. That is, I think that in a way, what seemed to be a certain axis is not present any longer, and maybe this is a consequence of the fact that Europe faced a very difficult situation in the Ukrainian front. So, looking back at Latin America, and the particular case of Brazil, of course, we welcome diversification, and developing as many relationships as possible, and as a country like with the potential of Brazil asks for. But definitely, the United States is the most important relationship we have had for the century, and what has been a very fruitful one. So we look at diversity and multipolarity, not something against X or Y country, but the fact of reestablishing a certain type of balance and establishing maybe some sort of deterrence also against the idea that countries have to follow their own paths. So I believe that the recent developments of Mercosur with the trade agreements, the potential of cooperation between Latin American countries, for instance, in the case of critical minerals, which they can develop together, not to the exclusion of other investors, but which it can develop on its own. So I believe that it's more a reestablishment of balances rather than something in which you are facing other countries. So that's how I would look at it. But again, if I may return the question, is how do we put Russia in the equation? We're speaking about Poles, and we have not spoken about Russia so far.
All right. So where, if you would like to take over.
Okay, great. I think we have a very fascinating discussion. You know, you ask about what's the future of the multipolar world. And now we hear our colleagues mention it. Where's the polar? What's the future? It doesn't really happening now. But actually, I tend to agree probably with our American colleagues that it's probably a little bit bipolar now. I mean, like President Trump was in Beijing, and also he was saying G2 and all those things, right? So that's a possibility. So I envision now, actually, we're getting a new multipolar world. Maybe there's a two major polar, but also there's many others middle polar as well. So it's a multipolar doesn't mean all polar are the same size. It could be two major polar, but then there's some other polars too. But then the problem is now, how can we achieve this new equilibrium among the major polars? And I see actually something's happening, like in the Trump's era, in the phase one, he was talking about strategic rivalry with China. Now, second term, he come to Beijing and said, let's have a strategic stability, a constructive. So that's a shift. So I think if U.S. and China can maintain a strategic stability, which I think they are trying to do, and we're going to see President Xi is going to visit U.S. in September. We're going to have an APEC summit. Trump's come to Shenzhen. And then G20 summit, President Xi going to Miami. We're going to see a lot of interchanges between these two polos. But I think that's probably exactly happening on the mid-powers. We're talking about mid-powers. So mid-powers actually now doesn't have to pick sides now. As Charles just said, it's no longer autocracy versus democracy. Then we have to really pick by the merits. And then so that's what the Carney said at Davos. Okay, he came to Beijing too, right? Carney actually made a lot of comments and, importing 50,000 China EV cars, lifted all the tariff for China against what the U.S. has done now. So I think, that's a good example of, in the future, this multipolar world. You have two major polos, but then other mid-sized mid-polos too, but then they don't pick sides now. They're actually working with whoever has the right, work with whom, doesn't pick a side. And then the important thing, I think China is probably doing the right thing, is that China is joining RCEP. You talk about where are the most successful cases. RCEP is very successful. ASEAN is China's largest trading partner. And of course also China has China African Summit, China Latin American Summit, China Arab Summit, China Central Asia Summit, cover all the region, economically focused, rather than military security focused. So I think, if that peaceful competition remains between the two major polos, all other polos will see, okay, whoever benefit, we don't have to pick sides, we'll choose whatever useful for its own country. So I think, that probably is a future multipolar world. And then I think that new equilibrium would really better than this former Soviet Union and the US, because it's not ideologically driven, it's economic development and sustainability driven. And then that's where China is doing all, leading the green powers, leading all those. That's why we see all the G7 leaders coming to Beijing, except Japan, right, this year. And also that's why we've seen that, you talk about autocracy versus democracy, we see how democracy works in the UK. 10 years, you change 7 prime minister, right? So that is what really. Democracy is messy. So what I'm saying is that you can't blame China for success just because of its autocracy. It's not, because China has meritocracy, has a consultative democracy, so things works well. So I really think the future multipolar world is really merit-based. And then you have two major polos, but the other mid-powers are now have the best of the two world now. They can really, they doesn't belong to any side, but then they can really push the new equilibrium towards the betterness of the world. And then that's probably the future version of the world.
Yes.
I mean, as an African, for me, I think positionality is always so interesting. And I'm so intrigued by the perspectives that are coming from the two panelists, because if I'm hearing correctly, it's the importance of kind of non-alignment, be able to choose your own partners and compete in a peaceful manner. And it's also an element of pragmatism. You choose your partners based on your interest, and as long as it's peaceful, etc. But I think there's a certain level of exceptionalism that I also want to highlight again in this room. From where we sit as Africa, we don't get afforded that. It's almost like our partners want to choose for us who we must partner with and who we must cooperate with. I mean, just as I was flying here, I kind of saw a tweet again by the U.S. ambassador who was highly critical on social media about our deputy president currently being in a state visit in China. as well as another engagement that we had with Iran. And again, the South African government came up and kind of criticized this non-diplomatic behavior. But I think the meat of what they're saying is that, you know, we are a country that's free to exercise our own foreign policy, and we exercise non-alignment based on the explanation I provided earlier. And what they say there is that, you know, the US is criticizing South Africa for cooperating pragmatically with certain partners, and yet they themselves cooperate with those partners. So what does that tell us from an African perspective? Are we also afforded this pragmatism and non-alignment that is emerging from the discussion here, which seems to be playing out quite well for other partners within different spheres of the world? So it's just an interesting thing that I wanted to kind of bring to the fore.
I think the U.S. was mentioned many times, so if you would like to respond, I mean, how do you see the Trump administration now in terms of emphasizing economics versus emphasizing military relations, and if you have any comments, Daniel?
I think that this is sort of a prelude before what the administration views will be sort of another round of more active competition. And so I think, you know, when you look at, and thinking about sort of Carney's comments, I mean, I think that he misled. I think that in some ways what he was actually speaking about was hedging behavior of these middle powers that sit within the Western Bloc. And so you have the EU's deal with India. Now India's not buying Russian kit. Nobody wants to buy Russian kit, so there's opportunity for European firms. The French, I guess, are going to work with the Gulf on maybe a new fighter jet. So there are opportunities, I think, within the system, but I still don't. I think that's sort of what he's talking about, though, is sort of alignments within an alignment. But I think sort of beyond those blocks, I don't see much that really would coalesce these middle powers to be able to sort of work together outside of sort of the traditional blocks. And so I think for the U.S., you know, economics are a key tool, I think, that the administration is trying to use in order to achieve more security ends. And so I think that you've seen that with tariffs. You've seen that with, favored rates. I think that this is the way that the administration is trying to use economic tools to achieve security ends. And so I think that that's sort of the way that I would think about that.
Thank you. Any other comments on? All right. So I think we are ready for our final theme. Our final theme is opportunities for constructive cooperation among major powers. And I wanted to ask, maybe let's start with Rachel. Where do you see the opportunities for cooperation? I know that you have been both in the US and now in India, so both between emerging powers and between so-called old and new powers.
I'll talk specifically about the opportunities between India and China, which is a relationship that gets a lot of discussion, especially in New Delhi. But I think it's difficult to talk about this relationship without sounding just aspirational and naive. So I think you have to keep it pretty narrow and focused. And I think right off the bat, you just have to name the asymmetry in this relationship pretty honestly, which is it is a relationship that is defined by an unresolved border. There is a massive and lopsided trade deficit. And on top of it all, there is real deep strategic mistrust. Who is Pakistan's #1 arms supplier? It's China, and it has been for a very long time. It has been for decades. So any cooperation between these two powers, I think, needs to be built on top of these realities. You can't just pretend them away. But I think there are real openings that are functional and economic rather than strategic. You can look at, for example, climate and clean energy supply chains. China dominates solar and battery manufacturing, and India needs to scale up fast. There's one. This is an area where economic logic, I think, could potentially outrun politics if we allow it to, and that's a good thing if both sides let that happen. I think there are multilateral venues where both sides have shared interest in reforming the system rather than confronting one another, certainly not as allies or partners, but more so as fellow travelers, I would say. So looking at things like WTO dispute settlement reform, looking at voice and representation at the IMF and the World Bank, coordinating on debt relief mechanisms for the Global South. These allow India and China to cooperate on reshaping rules without requiring the trust on security issues. But I think border de-escalation mechanisms remain the precondition for almost anything else. There was a 2024 steps towards disengagement where India and China reached an agreement on patrolling along the line of actual control in Ladakh. And this matters, I think, less for what they resolved than it does for showing that both sides still want a functioning crisis management channel. So at the end of the day, I think this is a relationship that's not moving toward a partnership in any meaningful sense, but it's one where both sides are testing how much transactional cooperation is really possible while strategic competition continues underneath.
Thank you. So turning over to Hu Yao, when Chinese policymakers think about potential conflict, what relationships are they most concerned about? Are they concerned more about U.S.-China relationship, China-India relationship, or how could you paint a picture of concerns?
Yes, thank you, Mihaela. Yeah, no, absolutely, great question. No, what I think actually, what Chinese leaders and the Chinese government has mentioned, emphasized many, many times, the core interest of the core is the Taiwan issue, the across Taiwan relation. I think if U.S. is really not taking a very aggressive posture and recognize one China principle, things are really okay. Because that's, I think, one of the things that's what U.S. realized now. You know, they want a bigger peace. President Trump said he wants to be a president of the peace in his inaugural speech. So he wants to settle help on this Russian-Ukraine conflict. He wants to settle Iranian-Israel-U.S. conflict. He needs China, right? Foreign Minister Wang Yi has phoned over 30-some foreign ministers to really calming down all sides on this peace deal. Mm-hmm. And then President Trump openly thanked China for supporting this Iranian U.S.-Israel memorandum of understanding. So you see, China is behind. Doing a lot of things happening for securing peace. So I think, but U.S. is also recognized China's interest. I'm glad to hear President Trump said, okay, we're not going to send soldiers to Taiwan 9,500 miles away, and we don't want to interfere, and we're temporarily hold weapons selling. So that's a good progress. Mm-hmm. But for further, you talk about, our colleague talked about China-India relation. I think China-India relation are really, as the two largest country, most populous country in the world, we've got an almost 3 billion population combined. Two really leading position in the BRICS countries. I don't see the reason why we can't get along well. I mean, of course we had a border clash before. We had a border clash with Russia quite many times. Now we can normalize the relation. I see no reason we cannot normalize that with India, because India, I remember when 80s, China was trying to learn from India. At that time, India GDP is almost as same or even larger than China. Now China is 5 times larger than India now. So I think there's a huge supplementary collaboration, because we have the same infrastructure issues, same environmental issues, same green power issues, same communication issues. That's just many times for China and India to work together. So I see, not only that, but also internationally, on the political stand, we safeguard the Global South, we safeguard the BRICS countries. I don't see the reason we cannot work together. I think, Foreign Minister Wang is just in India now, met Modi. And then so the G7, the BRICS summit in India this year, I think would be a good occasion. Our leader probably will go this year again. So I think there's a great opportunity for two countries to set aside that little differences, some differences, and really take the interests of the whole world, of the whole Global South, and of course also working with Europe, with US, with everybody. So I think if India really the leader of the long line movement, with Tito, you used to do that in Yugoslavia. Why not? Not taking sides is probably the best thing, and China always support, non-alliance movement. And I really think that India and China has a huge opportunity because we have so much economic to work together. And then at the end of the day, it's really the economy, the benefit, the livelihood of the people that really counts for the government, right, to sustain. So I don't think those temporary geopolitical alliance has any sense. And then these days we already have a big deterrence. There's no need to have a war. So I think China is a peaceful stabilizer, a factor for the region, for ASEAN. Recently China helped to calm down Cambodia and Thailand conflict as well. So I don't see that happening. And China never invaded any country for many, many decades now. And has not done that in history, never colonized any place or never sent and established military base anywhere. Whereas US has 800 military base. China has 8,000 economic project. The Belt and Road has a 10,000 economic project worldwide. That's the difference. That's, I think, China, India, and all the global south can work together.
So I think, thank you. I think it's interesting, especially in terms of India-China relationship, how optimistic you are about it. I think one area we forgot to mention, and I wanted to bring it to all of your attention, like G20, and I know this is for us to think about as a potential opportunity for collaboration across major powers. So do you have any thoughts, all of the panel, whoever wants to volunteer, on whether G20 plays an important role as an opportunity for collaboration, or do you see it moving in another direction?
Maybe I can just,
yes.
I can just add on that. I published an article in the Foreign Policy just about probably six months ago, talk about G20. I think G20 should be involved with the UN Security Council, because G20 is well balanced. There are 10 global South countries, 10 global North countries, and represents 85% of, even 90% of the global GDP if you include the African Union. So it's really important to get G20 into the Security Council rather than currently Security Council is about 15 countries. Let's get the G21 there. 5 permanent members, another 16 associate permanent members. But then we can probably, establish a rule if there's abuse of the single veto, like Russia and US, vetoed over 100 times, and China probably 20 times, 30 times. Let's reform that, and then then we can really have a more powerful, new power structure to reflect this multipolar world that give all the balanced power. Not only that, reform also World Bank, IMF, with China and India, and to be reflected there.
All right. Any other thoughts? G20, Rwanda? I think.
I'll come in because South Africa, of course, was presiding over the G20 in 2025, and we have been disinvited to participate in the current G20. And I think, for me, that cooperation has been one that shows me that different thinkers in different markets and different powers can cooperate and work together effectively. If I look at the G20 really championing some of the key global governance issues, a meeting of the G7 countries and a lot of the global South countries as well, for me it represents a platform where we can dialogue on issues, and even though our standpoints differ, we can arrive to some sort of consensus. It's an interesting space because while consensus, I mean, we are in a space of dissensus currently. We're unable to agree on a lot of things as countries. It's a space where ultimately we can make compromises and move the process forward. So I think it's a different experiment, and it's an interesting project for that reason. But the world is increasingly changing, and I think now we're also seeing the rise of plurilateral approaches, especially on issues of trade. And I think, some of us thought that, President Trump's term would just, shake things up a little bit, but would be able to kind of allow us to go back to normalcy once he finishes his term. But at this point, I think the world has been shaken up so much that that normal doesn't exist anymore. And we have to kind of now rethink our strategies to kind of suit this new normal that we find ourselves in. And I think, for me, the future of cooperation also needs to take consideration of how we then kind of interact with one another in a fair, equitable and respectful manner as equal partners of the global system. And certainly with the rise of IPSA and IPSA kind of morphing now into BRICS and other kind of formations that will come up, they will still need to cooperate with the West and with other formations as well, because ultimately cooperation is underpinned by us coming together and moving the agenda forward. So certainly G20 for me is a prime example of how we can kind of reach that cooperation.
Thank you. So I think we are now almost like the last panel before lunch, and I know I would like to give an opportunity to all of our panelists for some final thoughts. So, and I promised we'd leave on a positive note. So I wanted to ask you, is there any institution, diplomatic practice, or something that gives you hope and this inspires you for the future of the world order, and thinking about multipolarity, where are the opportunities that inspire you? So whoever wants to start, or we can just go straight, like if you can start, Manuel.
Yes, I think that the multilateral institutions, some of them, the bilateral maybe institutions which are in place, like Mercosur, I think that even if Mercosur has not so far fulfilled its promises, I think it has taken a new path in the last years, in the last 2 years. We look with great expectations to the EU Mercosur agreement, for instance. I think it can have very strong implications. I think we have to. I think that we cannot. We have to think about the problems of a system which was created in the post-war, but we cannot throw it off completely. So I think it's an important heritage we have to stick to in its at least in its philosophy of respect for rules or for international law, for the sovereignty of each country. And I think, as Henry has pointed out, I think that there is much we can work together. An example, a recent example was, I come back to the Mercosur EU agreement. Apparently, Brazil and Argentina would be in very different ideological positions, which I question if this is not a more stereotype than a reality. Both countries were absolutely enthusiastic about the agreement, and they worked together. So the fact that you have elements of polarization, for instance, you have the Amazonian countries, you have the boundaries of French Guiana, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela, and so on. We have a common cause against organized crime, which has become transnational. So there is no reason for us not to cooperate with all the countries which want to have a common activity in relation to this. So I am optimistic that pragmatism on issues which are common to us can become stronger than some labelings we have been living through, and that we can achieve. We can go after small successes which add together.
Thank you. Thank you. Daniel, moving on to you. What gives you hope?
I think that Ukraine has turned the tides. We've seen the failure of multilateralism. We can't get much of the global South to vote against Russia's aggression in Ukraine in the UN system. We've seen a failure there, but I think that the realities on the ground give me a lot of hope. I think it was the Saab CEO recently said the most important thing that the Western Bloc can do is to incorporate Ukraine's industrial base into the West fully. And so I have hope there. And I do think that China has in the past played a role in terms of warding off Russian nuclear ambitions or potential in that war. But China still is, of course, the main supporter of Russia's aggression. Russia couldn't propagate its war without Chinese assistance. So I do think that there's more that could be done there, and maybe there's opportunity if the reality on the ground is such that that sort of cost overrides the gain, the potential gain in that relationship. So, and I do think the U.S. and India can do a lot in terms of manufacturing. I think that there's a lot. We've only really sort of scratched the surface, I think, on that potential. So there are some areas I think that I have for hope, but I think multilateralism I'm a bit more dour on.
Thank you so much. So please, briefly, Rachel.
Yeah, I would just echo what Dan said. I think we're sort of moving toward an era of, I guess you going back to an era of coalitions of the willing. When multilateralism becomes broken, you see emerging partnerships between countries that want to get things done and that can get things done. And I think we've seen that, especially when it comes to Europeans in Ukraine as well. So that's what gives me hope.
Luanda?
I would say it's institutions and humanity. Specifically, if you look at the ICJ process and how the world is now coalescing in that process in the ICJ with the objective of preserving humanity. What's happening in Palestine is now a humanitarian crisis, and it's rallying around just humanity. I think that gives me hope that the world can make a difference still.
Thank you. Charles?
What I liked most about Mark Carney's speech was the fact that he acknowledged that the so-called rules-based liberal international order has never existed. This is basically what the French philosopher Voltaire said about the Holy Roman Empire in the 18th century. It's not holy, it's not Roman, and it's certainly not an empire. So the liberal international order was never complete. It was an aspiration, and millions of people throughout the world felt excluded from it. So let's not get too nostalgic about something that never existed. Moving forward, there's a lot that's actually happening underneath the surface. And at the risk of sounding nerdy, next month, the International Telecommunications Union will be meeting in Geneva and will be hosting the 7th Summit on Artificial Intelligence for Good. Now, we're all worried about artificial intelligence. We don't really have an international global framework to deal with this, but there are still modest, discrete, multilateral initiatives such as the ITU, which are still doing an extremely good job, which rarely gets mentioned by the media. Thank you.
Thank you. And please take us home. Take us to
Okay, thank you. I'll be brief. You ask what's the hope? What's make us still optimistic? Well, I think there's quite a few factors. I see while multilateral system is weakening, but then the poly-multilateral system is actually strong. Like RCEP, for example, the largest free trade agreement in the world. And ASEAN become China's largest trading partner. Of course, CPTPP also. You see, Australia, Japan take over after U.S. exit that, and then UK become a part of that, right? European Union is interested in that. China is interested in that. So I see that is still happening. And of course, AIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, a new development bank. So all those things are still happening. And then so I would think that. Of course, we still got the European Union, which is still there, and ASEAN is still pretty strong, and so we see the world is still on many fronts. The multilateralism is still advancing, but then, of course, the global system as a whole, we have been weakening, but I think now we have getting the multipolar world, and we need everybody to work together for a better future multilateral system.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank our panelists and also say this was a great discussion. I'm inviting everyone to lunch. Lunch is until 1 p.m. Thank you so much.